Seen David more recently than that. So welcome everybody. A few people are still joining. Thank you for coming. Whoops, a whole bunch of people are still in the waiting room. All right, they're still streaming in. Welcome everybody for joining. We are happy to have with us tonight Eva Moseley. I'm Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Mass Peace Action. I have known Eva for I guess about 13 years. Before I worked for MAPA, I joined another anti-war group called United for Justice with Peace. And Eva recruited me to the Afghanistan working group, or whatever they call it. Yeah, along with Sheila. And then the two of them were also interviewed me when I applied for the job at Mass Peace Action. So that's when I met Eva. But anyway, she has been on the board of MAPA from 1987 until this year, 35 years of service, and was one of the founders of our Palestine-Israel working group and was the founder of our Music for Peace concert series. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eva, and I think she's going to read some passages and probably make some remarks. Gary, you say you have no audio. Please turn up your volume. Does anyone else not have any audio? Sounds fine to me.
Okay, well, I'm going to read bits here and there of my memoir, and I probably have too many, so I will just stop whenever the time runs out. Before the war, I lived in a virtual paradise. George Berkeley, later author of Vienna and its Jews, heard this from a woman with a Central European accent in New York in the late 1940s. Quote, her face lit up and her voice took on an almost ecstatic tone. She was Viennese. Here was a mature and educated woman who still treasured glowing memories of the city that had forced her and her fellow Jews to flee for their lives. I was born into this virtual paradise on Christmas Eve, 1931, Christmas Day, 1931. We Steiners lived in a lower stratum of Viennese society than Berkeley's ecstatic lady. But I believe, and I knew the city for only 7 years as a child. But surely Berkeley's subtitle, The Tragedy of Success, is one explanation for the lady's rapture. Vienna enchanted her, at least partly, because of the presence and achievements of Jews. Gustav Mahler, Sigmund Freud, Helene Deutsch, Arthur Schnitzler, Stefan Zweig, and many others, known and unknown. Zionist or not, religious or secular, along with the beautiful surrounding, the wonderful architecture, the music, the cafes, and so on. So I'm skipping over a lot of family stuff because it's sort of complicated and at times painful. To 1938. These family matters didn't exist in a vacuum, and eventually public events impinged drastically on private ones. As Hitler annexed his native Austria to his adopted country, and shortly after this Anschluss of March 12, 1938, put a young Adolf Eichmann in charge of making Vienna Judenrein, clean of Jews. I think this is where the term ethnic cleansing comes from. For my first 6 years, being Jewish was, or seemed, inconsequential. But one day in 1938, walking home from the Jewish school with a boy from the Gentile school, these were public schools segregated after the Anschluss. I feared that as we talked about our family, he would realize that I was Jewish. And by then I knew that that could be dangerous. Along with, we were, as I think you all know, that the Anschluss happened peacefully. The Austrians, mostly, many of them, welcomed the Nazis, so there was no fighting. But we did have blackout days, and you could hear planes flying, and you could see soldiers marching through the streets. And there were these Nazi banners with the Hakenkreuz, the whatever it's called in English, everywhere.
Yeah.
Along with marching soldiers and planes, I heard the ominous word "Krieg," war, and imagined an acceptable way for men to fight. I envisioned a large grassy sports field with a high fence around it. At each end of the center line, referees sat in lifeguard chairs. The armies fought inside the fence, the referees keeping score and reminding them of the rules. Civilians going by on the way to work or school or shopping might stop and watch for a while and then go about their business. Alas, war has never been like this, and World War II was even less so. With each war, the proportion of civilian to military casualties seems to increase. So later that year, 1938, we had what was called Kristallnacht. That's the way it's pronounced in German. Halsey, my father, was one of thousands of Jewish men who disappeared that day. Later, Mother told us that for 2 weeks she ran around the city with a sweater and a bar of chocolate. She was a great believer in chocolate, looking for him. The Jewish authorities, Kultusgemeinde, assured her that no Jews had left Vienna. Eventually, he sent a postcard from Dachau. Because my mother had rich relatives in New York who could vouch for us and provide the necessary papers, we were able to leave. And when it was clear that we could leave, they let my father come home. We packed a large lift, as it was called, a crate, taking some furniture, including the tall mirror that my mother used for fitting. She was a dressmaker, a very special dressmaker, and some other furniture. I had to choose one doll to take, and my brother, Paul, had to leave his electric train. He showed a neighbor who came to buy it how it worked, and she was so touched that, all teary, she declared she couldn't bear to deprive him of it. My Aunt Anna was still contemptuous 6 decades later. He couldn't take it with him, So what use was it to weep? Better to give him some money for it. Then Paul heard that he couldn't take his bicycle. Maybe I don't want to go to America after all, he said. But what he or any of us wanted didn't matter. A friend who also escaped from Vienna could have been, I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my glasses. I don't know why. Could have been speaking for my family when she said, "Why me? I wasn't anybody special." She claimed to believe that she had a good angel watching over her. It's possible that she did. It's impossible to prove that she did or that she didn't. But I don't believe she did. And anyway, to say an angel or God saved me is still a way to be special. What about the unlucky ones? Where were their angels? Why didn't God save them? No, it was just a matter of good or bad luck. So now we're in New York and we're living on, well, at first, for the first month in New York, we had other relatives here who were helpful. We lived in one room in a brownstone rooming house. On West 88th Street. My first grade teacher issued a reader, and the next day demanded that I cover it. Such book covers were unknown in Vienna, but somehow Mother found some brown paper and wrapped the book as a package. Spotting it the next day, the teacher held it up, and she and the class had a good laugh about it. It was a petty cruelty that allows people to feel superior to an outsider. It's almost my only memory from that time. Then we moved uptown to Manhattan Avenue, where this is all on the west side, for those of you who know New York. And there I had a kinder teacher because I decided I wanted to be a teacher. And one of my few memories is of a little Negro classmate who went 2 blocks out of his way to walk me home with his arms slung around my shoulders, flattered. Wait a minute, I have to find that place here. I was flattered, but mainly I was amazed at how uninhibited he was. Our classmates skipped down the street chanting, "Ronnie has a girlfriend, Rita has a boyfriend." I didn't really think I had a boyfriend, but they did. So it felt as if I was accepted and at least partly tentatively at home after only a short time in New York. Then we moved further down. We were at 101st Street. We moved to 35 West 82nd Street, which was more convenient for the rich ladies who came to my mother for their clothes. So I write a little about what I going to the theater and trying to write a musical after I had seen a musical. Often alone, only sometimes happily, I founded the Bathtub Exercise Club as the only member and all the officers, I wrote the rules and planned all the activities. And then later, I declared myself not a joiner. One way to be different, which for many youthful years was important to me. My Aunt Vicky, who for many years lived with us, and had actually come in 1938 before we became early 39. Vicky had Mother and me join her in working for Roosevelt's last campaign, 1944. She also got me to march with her union down 8th Avenue to Union Square to protest the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. And in 1948, I campaigned for Henry Wallace, the Progressive Party candidate for president, living in apartment buildings and learning efficient ways to stuff envelopes, very useful later still. At the party's convention in Philadelphia, I sang in the chorus. Pete Seeger sang with us. That was thrilling, but I was glad when it was over and we could go home. Wallace won barely 2.4% of the votes. With our winner-take-all elections, voters who favored him were afraid that a vote for Wallace was a vote for Dewey, so they voted for Truman. Disillusioned by the result, I became mostly apolitical, perhaps also because of the pall thrown over society or dissent by the witch hunters, J. Edgar Hoover, Hewitt, and Joe McCarthy, among others. One Saturday afternoon, I was at my best friend Lucy's house. She was also from Vienna. And my mother called, asking me to come home. When I protested, she said, "We have something to tell you, then you can go back to Lucy." Both parents were there, and Paul, my brother. Mother said, "We're getting divorced, and you two are staying with me, okay?" Okay? Not okay. But I didn't say anything. And I don't think my father said anything. I went back to Lucy's and said nothing. Did out during 3 years of high school. Life without my father wasn't so terrible. He wasn't much of a father. But divorce meant chaos and shame. It wasn't so rare then or even earlier, but it was usually hushed up. No one else's parents were divorced, as far as I knew. Fatherless friends had lost theirs through death. It was shame that kept my mouth shut. This is from junior high school, which was Joan of Arc Junior High School on West 91st Street, I think. Looking kids from various neighborhood schools. One vivid homeroom memory dates from the first day as the teacher read the roll for the first time. The class, among the clearly Jewish or otherwise familiar names, she read Yoshio Kishi. For most of us, this was the first encounter with a Japanese name, outside the pages of a newspaper or the war news on the radio. Some children laughed. I'm almost certain I wasn't one of them. I knew how it feels to be laughed at by your classmates. Yoshio cried. So this is a chapter about Camp Midfield, where we spent a great deal of my youth. It belongs to the Nature Friends of America. The Natur Fund, which means nature friend, began in Vienna in 1895. Part of the social change caused by increased urbanization and industrialization. Blue-collar workers couldn't afford to stay at mountain hotels. So through the Austrian and German Social Democratic parties, they organized to arrange outings, maintain trails, and build huts and lodges in the mountains. The mountains were actually not very far from Vienna, and they cover most of Austria, which you probably know. Members who emigrated to the US launched the Nature Friends of America, and by the early 1920s, the group was large enough to buy a defunct farm near Midfield, New Jersey, and eventually 3 former farms in the Catskills as well. In my memory, it was all beautiful, even magical, and Midfield was my childhood paradise. At first, the Nature Friends swam at a nearby Stevens farm, a farm that was still a farm. But one day, an interracial group went to swim and were turned away. So the members dammed the stream and built a magnificent swimming pool. 2 sides were the natural rock, and 2 sides were poured concrete. There were high and low diving boards and a shallow kiddie pool at the natural end. This is where I learned to swim. I can try to hold up the photo. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see it?
Yes, it's a little fuzzy, but we see it.
Yeah, well, it's fuzzy.
Swimming pool surrounded by trees.
It's an old postcard. What was paradise for me meant worries for grown-up. The philosophy of inclusiveness, cooperation, and modest fees continually bumped up against economic realities so that it was hard to keep them going. Then in 1947, when the Nature Friends appeared on the US Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, some of you will remember that, some members opted for a non-political hiking and sports club. Others felt committed to socialism. My mother, who then owned a bungalow there, was involved in these discussions, arguments, and in the eventual split in the organization. Then I was away at college and not paying attention. The FBI began taking down license plate numbers at the camp entrance, and some in the surrounding hills, known or suspected members of the John Birch Society or the Klan, were also hostile. In October 1966, the clubhouse, which the members had built, burned to the ground. At least one member recalled that firemen stood watching it burn. So it was sold, and it is now the new Weiss Center for Education, Arts, and Recreation. So now we're at the Bronx High School of Science, which I went to for 3 years after 3 years of junior high. I adored math and was good at it. Was good at it, but not anymore. I was even good at solid geometry with soft voice Edward Lepovsky. But the true heartthrob was Dr. Jules Levity, who was elegant and dashing, always turned out in a fabulous suit, one light green herringbone tweed, another navy basket weave wool. Witty, urbane, brilliant, but respectful of students. He taught math 9, sort of it was the 4.5 year of math. An amalgam of probability theory, statistics, infinity theory, and other arcana. Years later, I learned that Dr. Levity was blacklisted as a communist. He was, quote, the most distinguished victim, unquote, of the U.S. Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. And although regarded by many as the most brilliant math teacher in the United States, he was fired in 1953, causing the superintendent of schools considerable embarrassment. He was reinstated in 1956. A summary of the story in a book called The Anti-Communist Purge under Truman and Eisenhower made me even prouder to have been his student. Now we're at Mount Holyoke, which was kind of a culture shock in many ways. The big sister, little sister cult and the class colors were among the many things strange to an exiled New Yorker. Our class color was green. The juniors, collectively and individually, wait a minute, sorry. The juniors collectively and individually were our big sisters. And on occasion, we sang the sister song responsibly, even at table meals. For Pearson's was the dorm, had 15 juniors for about 100 freshmen. And the song went, dear old pals, jolly old pals, always together and old whatever. Ridiculous song. I had a wonderful English teacher, Marianne Brock, and I adored her. And some of the other women professors, Mildred Allen, who taught physics and had me working in the lab. I was planning to be a physicist. And there were many others like them, although at least half the faculty were male, although all the students were female. But there were plenty of women professors. These seemingly independent and content blue stockings were all single, while most alumni had triple barrel names, successful husbands, and broods of children, and many classmates were at least as interested in who got pinned or engaged, where the next date was coming from, and whom to take to the prom, as they were in what Plato had to say, or Newton, or Shakespeare, or even Emily Dickinson, an alumna who did not date to graduate. Or how, this was another thing they didn't seem interested in, or how to earn a living if, heaven forbid, one didn't catch a husband. Mount Holyoke implicitly offered a choice, I thought, career and spinsterhood, or marriage and family, and no career. Given that choice, I wanted the latter. In fact, I thought that the perfect life would include work as a man's assistant, preferably my husband. And that actually the way things worked out for a time, only they weren't so perfect.
Eva, let me come in at this stage. It's 12:35. You're in college. Sorry, it's not 12:35, 7:35. My thought is you might want to speak for about 10 more minutes and touch on maybe a couple of really critical turning points in your life, marriage, divorce, the death of your husband, or something like that. And, because otherwise we're not going to get time for any questions.
Right.
But I also want to ask the group here if they agree with that, or if they want, more detail readings.
I knew it was too long. I didn't know how much.
You've lived a long life, so no surprise there.
Hmm?
You lived a long life, no surprise there.
Yeah, right. Yes, but this isn't about all my life. It's only about half of it. So eventually, I guess I'll just briefly summarize it. Through some friends, actually a Midfield friend, through her and her husband, I met a young man who was a year ahead of me in college, and he was a junior when I was a sophomore. And he was pre-med, and he still had a lab at Harvard Medical School, as far as I know, last I heard. And so we were an item for a while, and then unfortunately I ditched him. But I met another Harvard student who was studying Sanskrit, and he got me interested in what I call the one great religion. I wish I could find a message about that. And so I wasn't a devotee of mysticism for very long, but I remained interested in Asia. And my first job was with the Asia Foundation in San Francisco, which turned out to be partly, at least, a CIA front. And then I went back to New York and got a job at the IPR, the Institute of Pacific Relations, which was kind of at the other end of the spectrum politically, and was actually done in by the FBI, and that same the Internal Security Subcommittee, the same committee that tried to do in Dr. Levity. But I really liked the IPR, and it was having a tough time because it was being founded and had its tax exempt status revoked, and so lost a lot of support. But but I had a job there, and it was my second best job. This is early 1958, and all the big shots in the organization had left for Lahore for the IPR's last international conference. And a letter came from a man who had experience in Asia and needed a job. So I answered and said, there were no openings, but I will make sure that Mr. Holland, the boss, would see his letter when he returns. Soon this young man appeared and talked about having about a possible job. And an article was about to be published in a magazine. I didn't tell him I had the only job that might be right for him. Then he came back and said, there's something I forgot to ask you. Will you have dinner with me? I had dinner with me. In fact, we dined and danced. And I agreed to go to it to see a Chinese opera with him the next Saturday. Then he called Friday. Could I have dinner that night? He had something to tell me. No, I had work to do. I was editing a friend's dissertation. The Chinese friend. It needed a lot of editing. He persisted, and I gave it. We sat at a table for two, very close to two other tables for two, as he told me that he had fallen in love with me and wanted to marry me. I was flattered, but kind of annoyed at feeling rushed. Anyway, I won't go into how I agreed quickly, and we married after a month. I don't recommend this to other people. Let's see. So he was still looking for a job, and he got a job with CARE. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. CARE hired George. He called me at work. We were going to Macau. Where? I guess I've heard of it, but it was just a vague name. I found it on a map of China, and with mixed feelings, packed up things to take and things to leave. For my first trip abroad, except for ones I couldn't read about, Cuba and Mexico. Cuba for an abortion, and Mexico for a friend's divorce. Let's see. Knowing George barely 4 months, I was about to accompany him to the proverbial ends of the earth. He had lived in China as a child, so I think he was always trying to get back to China. And Macau was, you can see China from Macau. And by now, I think Macau is China, just like Hong Kong. So in Macau, he started a milk feeding program in the schools. And it was quite popular. The kids seemed to like it. It was powdered milk that had to be mixed, but they did that. But the original pair of food parcels, which were designed for Europe, included powdered milk, and the Chinese would have nothing to do with it. And they wouldn't buy milk, you could buy it there because they were European colonies. As many Chinese cannot digest dairy products, this program may have been one of the good intentions that paved the road to hell. George also distributed books, school kits, fishermen's kits, and so on. Now and then he took me to a food distribution or presentation of sewing machines, but mostly I was on my own. I took Cantonese lessons, went to market, made curtains, shopped a bit for Chinese antiques, and felt useless. I couldn't find a niche. Welfare agencies were official, assistência pública. This is a Portuguese colony. Catholic, Protestant, or political, communist or Kuomintang, national. There was no organization of secular Jews. I miss having women friends and having work of my own. But eventually, the next spring, I found something useful to do. Among the car horns, pedicab bells, and cries of vendors in Macau streets, there was music. The musicians were blind and they were good. George's assistant, Augusto, helped me round them up. They gathered in our living room with their instruments, drank tea, spat on the floor, and performed so I could pick the pieces likeliest to appeal to Western ears. Then Augusto and I marched them to Radio Villa Verde. And the head of the radio station provided a sound engineer and a studio. The musicians performed. I paid them something, and they went back to playing on the street. So I sold the tapes to Folkway, which was, it's a good outfit, but the owner was very disorganized, and I had a lot of trouble with him. They left my name out, which was against the contract, so it wasn't clear how it got to Folkways, but anyway. So I think I am skipping. So then we went to New Haven, and George got a master's in something about Chinese, and I produced Jessica.
Eva, even book readers have to observe time limits sometimes. I request you to
Okay.
5 more minutes, and then we're going to take questions.
All right.
Okay, go for it.
So I'm going to go to (1975), which is after our divorce, and George remarried, and late April 1975, I got a phone call from a man named Pierre at Tufts History Department, where George had taught for 2 years. And he told me that George had been killed on Sunday. We never found out. I never found out anyway what really happened. I mean, it was pretty clear what happened. He was burned. A friend took me to the spot the next year, and you could see a scorch mark on a tree where his car had rolled and hit the tree, but he was outside the car and was burned to death. And for some reason, which I suspect was political, but I don't know, the the police didn't really investigate. And although I got in touch with Ted Kennedy's office, and they got in touch with it was in Maryland. It happened in Maryland, and got in touch with Macau, one of Maryland's senators. But nothing ever happened. Nothing ever, at least if somebody knew what was going on, I didn't. And neither did my children, his children. So let me just end with what I'm most worried about. I have a long bit in the afterword about Israel and, my problems with Israel. But although I worry about the future of that land with two peoples, each with a complicated history, each speaking a Semitic language, perhaps sharing common ancestors in biblical Canaan, I worry more about three major evils, any of which could doom the Holy Land along with the rest of the biosphere. When I worked at the Schlesinger Library and collecting archives from people, personal papers, and so on, at some point I started to say that if we keep them, we will keep them forever, however long that turns out to be. Although I wasn't yet as worried about the future of humanity and the biosphere as I am now. So the three evils I see, the main evils, are nuclear weapons and nuclear power. They don't know what to do with the waste. It's not an innocent procedure. The second is global warming, and I don't need to explain it to this audience, I think. And the third is, behind both these dangers, and especially behind global warming, is the third danger, overpopulation of humans. The author of the 1948 book was worried that the world population was about to hit 2 billion. Now we just hit 8 billion. The Earth isn't getting any bigger, and it's not going to. So I think it's important to try to at least stabilize the population and, if possible, reduce it. Let's hope that the solution to overpopulation is not danger number one, nuclear weapons, or too much of not danger number two, global warming. I'll stop there on that happy note.
Great. Thank you, Eva. I will just say, when I read this book, it was exactly like Eva was talking to me. She has led an examined life. The book is full of insights about her own life. And I just thought that was really an interesting perspective that she's taken. She thinks about how her childhood and everything has affected how everything turned out. And I just thought it was fascinating and compelling. Let me ask, so we have several, put your questions in the chat. You could also raise your virtual hand. Using if you go down to the bottom, there's a, what is it, reactions menu item, and you can raise your hand. But I have a few questions that people have already thrown into the chat, so I'm going to start out with those. Jane Knowles asks, looking back at your time at Mount Holyoke, did you have any feminist consciousness then?
Any feminist what?
Consciousness.
No. In fact, I was more something of an anti-feminist for quite a long time. So Jane, you and I can talk about it sometime. Afternoon.
So Mary and Sarah asks, I would like Eva to talk about how the Schlesinger Library got started and how you got started there.
Well, it got started in 1943 when a woman named Maud Wood Park, who was an alumna and a very prominent, quite a prominent suffragist, gave a bunch of suffrage archives to Radcliffe. And for a long time, it was known as, what was it known? The Women's Archive. And it was called the name as pronounced by the family and by me, and by now nobody else, is Schlesinger, the German pronunciation. So the Schlesingers, this was Arthur Schlesinger, a senior, who was a history professor at Harvard, and later, of course, junior too. And they were very supportive. And Mrs. Schlesinger actually did some women's history research. And when George left, I needed a job. And I went to Radcliffe as an alumna. And they had one person doing both alumni placement and jobs, jobs at the college. So, which was fortunate. So I went to work there. The first year I was the assistant to the curator's manuscript, and I earned $3.10 an hour, and was part-time. And then the next year she left to go to divinity school, and I was just moved into her job without a search or anything. And it turned out to be sort of custom made for me, that job. It was wonderful, although I haven't missed it since retiring.
Great. Okay. Linda Morrison asks, could you tell us something about your work with Pat King?
Well, Pat King was the longest. I think she was director of the library the longest. She was not there when I started. It was a woman named Jeanette Cheek who hired me, and who then promoted me too. So I'm very grateful to her. But she retired, and Pat King came in. I'm not sure just what I can say about it. She, it's library stuff. I don't know quite what to say.
Go ahead.
She was wonderful. She was very, very devoted and hardworking. I didn't always agree with her. And somebody would come along with some collection that really wasn't right for us, or with a project that really wasn't right for us. And some of us would start singing, da, 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 dum, 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 dum. I don't know. I don't sing well anymore. I'm just a girl who can't say no. And she sometimes got us into hot water with somebody who, she said, we're going to take these papers, and I would look at them and say, no, it doesn't make any sense because we don't have the other stuff around. One was a California woman who was a an environmentalist in California. And so to understand what she was doing, you really needed stuff that was available in California, not in Cambridge. But anyway, and Pat, she died very young. She died young. And so for about 15 months, I was acting director and learned that I didn't want to be an administrator.
Mhm. Okay. So Jane Collins asks, we had an anti-war vigil in Harvard Yard for many years after 9/11, and you, Eva, were a regular. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, what's the name?
Jane Collins.
Oh, Jane Collins, yeah. Yes, right. It was started by somebody who was, and I remember where he worked, but not quite what the program was. He worked on 1737 Cambridge Street.
Weatherhead Center, right? Yeah.
So what?
That building later was called the Weatherhead Center or something.
Probably. And yeah, we used to, I think we had a vigil, and then we would walk around. I think Jane probably remembers better than I do. And it had to do with the Iraq War, I believe. I think it started in 2005 or something like that. And then when Obama came in? I'm afraid I don't remember much about it, except that I liked participating in it, and maybe Jane Collins could say more about it than I can.
Okay, what I'll do is change the view to gallery so people can see each other. We can switch toward a more conversation mood, but I still have more questions to ask, so I'm going to keep on with that though. Pat Westwater Jung asks, I've known Eva as an amazing activist. Can she tell us what of her life experiences motivated her passion for social justice, perhaps in particular for Palestinian rights?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is much more of an activist than I am, or even more than I've ever been. Because there's a lot of other things in my life, like writing this book, which is not directly activist. I think my focus on Palestine is because I'm so appalled at Israel. And it gets worse all the time. I mean, just was last week or whenever they had that election. Now it's even more awful than it was before. And I'm not I feel different about being Jewish than I used to. I was always really proud. And I mean, there's still a lot to be proud about, and there does tend to be a larger proportion of Jews who are prominent and brilliant and talented and so on, and there are the proportion of the population. But the fact that it's Jews that are doing these horrible things every day in Israel, and the land they occupy illegally, and nobody stops them. And I don't know actually where it comes from. I think my parents were social democrats, but they weren't particularly active. The only thing I know that they did was after there was a revolution in 1934, and they hid one of the participants, a communist, because the police were after him. And I knew him slightly, and I have stayed with one of his sons and wife. So, that's that old friendship. But I don't, it's really hard to know where it comes from. It just, I've always hated injustice because it's unjust. I don't know, it seems so obvious to me. But anyway, so Pat Westwater Young goes back and forth to the unholy land and has friends there, and is much more active than I am. So are there more questions? The cluster.
Oh, sorry. Siddhartha Banerjee, could you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. But first, a quick aside. I was reading Leonina's comment about her life in Brazil and her life in the US. I was wondering if there's a place where I can find further information about her life. My keyboard apparently has been disabled. Now my question for Eva, perhaps what you recall about life in Vienna might help you to answer a question which has troubled me about a little aspect of my family's history. My mother's brother, who was born around 1915, went to Vienna for medical studies, to medical school. Yet when he came back, I recall I was born in the early 50s, hearing about his experiences in Vienna, but very little, if anything at all, about anti-Semitism. I would say he was there between 1934 and 38, and I thought that was quite remarkable. Was it very subtle before the Anschluss began? Was it less easily understood and interpreted as anti-Semitism by other observers who were non-Jewish? Can you help me understand that?
I'm not sure I can help. It certainly wasn't as pronounced as it became in 1938, where Hitler decided the Jews, although Hitler, I gather from something I read, despised the Slavs almost as much as the Jews. He and of course he tried to take them on too. That one of the things that did him in. I don't, I was a child then, and as I said, I didn't. There were so many Jews there, and I think most of the people we knew and spent time with were Jewish. And as far as I remember, like that lady that George Berkeley sort of was puzzled by, we had good lives there. So there were religious Jews, there were unreligious Jews like us, and there was there's this the second borough, Leopoldstadt. There's now a play about it in New York. There was a concentration of Jews there, but we didn't live there. My grandparents lived there, but my family did not. The rest got out and moved elsewhere when they could. I don't know. There were all these stories, both in Germany and Austria, and I suppose elsewhere, of neighbors and friends and supposed friends and servants, turning on their, as if they were just waiting for the Nazis to say, it's okay to hate the Jews and kill them or harass them or whatever. I don't know. But, one of my aunts married a Gentile. He was not an anti-Semite. His family wasn't. So I don't think I understand it better than anybody else. I mean, it's here too. I think wherever there are Jews, they're anti-Semite. We have plenty of it in this country, apparently. Although I think some of it is because of Israel, but probably not all of it.
Great. Okay, well, so we are losing some participants, just to give everybody an update. We peaked out at 96, we're down to 61. So there are those that have heard enough and have moved on, but I still have 4 or 5 questions to go and more continue to come in. So let's keep going a bit longer.
Okay.
But if you have something else you have to do, we understand.
It was a question from Dick Foster, which I would like to.
Okay, go ahead and answer. Dick's cluster was, what did you have to leave out of the book for reasons of space or editing that you wish could be in there?
Right, he's a writer. We have commiserated about how hard it is to get your book sold. I actually had to leave out quite a bit, and I am working on a sequel, or I'm trying to work on a sequel called Outtakes, with some of the stuff I couldn't, including a fairly long essay about their place in the library and women's history and some of the people I got to know. Well, not all women, but mostly women. And there's essays about politics and religion and so on. Yes, there was quite a bit I had to leave out. And actually, my publisher wanted to make it even shorter. But at least he's charging, I think, a very modest price for such a long book. And I'm grateful for that.
Great. Okay, let's keep going. Mary Ellen Kirklos, how did you find your way to MAPA and the Freeze movement? That back then it was called Sane Freeze.
Well, I can't remember when I first, I mean, most of my earlier political stuff was more, like working for a candidate. But because I think it's because of Camp Midfield that I always knew sort of what was going on among lefties. And certainly Sane was known generally. I mean, Sane was something of a force, although not much, perhaps. I know that and I was also in Women's Right for Peace, and they were working on the test ban, and it was 2 little kids, and, not doing too much. But I think, in the Freeze movement, I mean, I thought it was such a wonderful idea, because I thought disarmament, going from what we had and still had to total disarmament is just unrealistic. But the freeze said, just, freeze where you are now, and then we can talk about reducing gradually. And I thought that was a brilliant idea, practical. Of course, it didn't happen, but at least not quite the way it was supposed to. But there have been reductions. I mean, even Reagan, who would have thought that Ronald Reagan would reduce nuclear weapons, but he seemed to get it before he went gaga. I mean, it was, I lived in places where it was New York or San. I don't think I ever did anything political in San Francisco, but certainly in New York, you just heard about it and he went and did it. I didn't always enjoy it, but I thought it was necessary. And then MAPA, once I was involved with the peace group in Medford, and then we worked together in the freeze. I actually went to the national conference of the freeze in 1983, I think, in St. Louis. And I made friends among peacenik, and it just seemed, it always seemed so urgent to do something about it, because the world seemed nearly always to be going in the wrong direction.
Okay, thanks. So, next up, we got Leonina Herringer, who wrote a long comment in the chat. I'm going to read quickly. Eva has been an inspiration for me. I'm a Brazilian, a lawyer by training in my country, and a house cleaner here in the US for 37 years. I started to write a memoir in 2011 while attending a class called Environmental Biography with Stephen Holmes at the Cambridge Center for Adult Ed. That's when I discovered at the age of 57 that one of my great-great-grandfather's wife wasn't my great-great-grandmother, but rather one of his slaves. Yet 11 years after that, I still don't know this great-great-grandmother's name, although I've talked to several of my white-only side of the family, hired a lawyer and a historian in my hometown to do research. Eva has been helping me with editing the English version of my book, and reading her book has gotten me even more aware of the importance of recording my own experience as she lets us travel time and the world with her recordings. Comment, Eva?
Yes, well, she cleans my house every other week. And I think it's wonderful that she's so
She
engaged.
claims you're helping her edit her book.
Well, I did, yeah, she gave me a chapter or two, and I did that, but now she was here yesterday, and as soon as she walked in the door, she started complaining about her editor who is in Brazil, and I have endless complaints about my editor, who is not picked by me but by my publisher. And I could tell you stories all night about him. But I thought that was sort of amusing. I mean, it's tough being edited. I edit other people, that's okay. But no, actually, my editor had some good ideas, but he was also not very helpful. So yeah, and she's trying to get a a good version of her book in time for Christmas, I think. And of course, there's not much time left, so she's kind of frustrated.
Yeah. And I just have to riff on this for 1 second. There's another person here tonight who's got a memoir from a Vienna from her mother that grew up in Vienna and is wondering how to get it published. So I've connected her to Eva. But so there's two other memoirists, or a daughter of a memoirist here tonight. So the whole memoir form is something we haven't really looked at much in MAPA. So we're getting a lot of authors out of the woodwork here. Let me go to Gary Goldstein. And you've raised your hand, Gary, so why don't you unmute and make your comment or question?
Yes, thank you, Eva. I've read parts, not all of your book yet, but I was attracted to the chapter on Oxford, and I wondered, because we've spent time in Oxford. I wondered, did you get involved at all in the CND or in the peace movement there?
No, actually, no, I was one of the passages I couldn't read was about I'm trying to think where it was. No, it's different being in a country where you're not a citizen. At least I find I didn't come across any anti-nuclear activists, although I suppose they were everywhere. But I guess in Oxford, we had 2 years in Oxford with a year in Hong Kong in between. I loved living in Oxford, I must say. So no, and the only thing, I mean, one day, it was in 1968, George went to Paris to, take part in the student demonstration. And he came back with a paving stone that had hit him on the shoulder. He was very happy with that, being part of the action. And where I write about that, I wrote that the only political memory, well, there was Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, I think, came when we were living in London. They came, and I did go to hear them. And I did, sing "We Shall Overcome," swaying back and forth with my, hanging on to a very startled Brit. But not in Oxford. So the only political thing I remember from Oxford is, or it's not really political, is a graffiti on the outside wall of the women's loo at the Oxford railway station, where somebody had written, "Yanks, get out of Vietnam, come to Britain." So that was not political.
So here, I think this is the last question I've got from Ruth Foss. It's overwhelming how many things need attention in this world. It's amazing and wonderful how many things you do and have done. How have you chosen where to focus your activism, given all the problems?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, and activism is one thing, money is another. You can spread it around more than, there are only so many hours in a day. But Ruth and I are on the board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Eastern Massachusetts. So that's one issue. It's basically a consumer organization. And I got interested in it because of Jessica Mitford's book, The American Way of Death. And also because I realized that even I am going to die along with everybody else. although it's hard to believe, but it's true. I know it's true. So it's so I do a little of that, and but I really think, I mean, if I were younger and had more energy than I do now, I think I would do more about population. I really think that and it's almost a taboo subject. I think there are people who think that, you know, I as a white person want people of color to not breed so much. I want everybody not to breed so much. And there are plenty of white people who have too many children. And certainly, and we, especially in this country, use a lot more resources per capita than anybody. So we have done an outside amount to make the world more dangerous in every way. Also, it was white people who invented nuclear weapons, as far as I know.
Okay, I think we come to the end. I'd like to just ask everybody to give Eva a big hand and thank you for both for 35 years of service on MAPA's board, but also for sharing her life with us and her reflections. And I think it's just incredibly fascinating and sends our thoughts off in so many directions to respond. So thank you everyone for coming. I didn't know if anybody was going to show up to this event, but I think we had a great,
I have a question.
Conversation. Go for it, Eva.
If anybody knows a book reviewer or has any pull with a publication that publishes book reviews, I would like to know about. Because it was actually fun writing the book, although sometimes hard. It was much harder to find a publisher, and now it's even harder to get the book noticed because there's so many new books, and you know, the publisher does a little, but doesn't amount to much. So thank you all for listening to me about it.
Thank you.
Thank everyone. Good night.
Bye.